Yeah, what I would say is that the song is something of an enigma in as much as if you try and read it linearly, you're going to end up with problems. But what I've discovered is that in some parts, it's very royal. So, in other words, there's a royal feel about it. The people are wearing things that are royal. There's an emphasis on the clothing, on the perfume.
Hello and welcome to It Means What It Means, the podcast in which a guy with some college and a day job has long-form conversations about biblical texts. Today's guest is Gavin Fernandes. We'll be discussing his Journal of Biblical Literature article, Returning the King and the Women to the Beginning of the Song of Songs. There was a lot I did not know about the Song of Songs. I will let the conversation reveal that to you, the listeners. But he has some pretty interesting takes, and this was a very fun conversation. So without further ado, here is Gavin Fernandes. Gavin Fernandes, welcome to the podcast.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Before we get going, will you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. First of all, again, thanks for inviting me. I like what you're doing here. It's a pleasure to be here on the show. So, I've been a Christian pastor of two churches in London and Cambridgeshire. I completed my PhD on Song of Songs, biblical text at University of Nottingham. I'm currently a part-time tutor in hermeneutics as well as Old Testament for an institution called London School of Theology, which is validated by University of Middlesex. I'm a part-time instructor and course director for a biblical training course for lay internationals in Cambridge, and that's called the Philip Project. And one other hat I wear is that I'm a research associate for University of Pretoria in South Africa as well. I'm married to a pharmacist from Hong Kong, but I like to say I'm married to a Chinese drug dealer, which always raises a few eyebrows. And we have two teenage children who are a joy to parent.
I have two teenagers in my home too, and they are a joy, a very, very special kind of joy. No, that is quite a CV. And actually, so for the listeners, real quick, on the article, so we're going to be discussing your JBL article. On the articles under the author's name, they'll list like their email and their institution. And I was like, wow, he's got quite a bit more than most people have. Most people just have one institution. I was a little worried that I wouldn't be able to find you with just one email address. But so the name of the article is Returning the King and the Women to the Beginning of the Song of Songs. And I think this is a really interesting case for this podcast because you are addressing something that, at least for me, anecdotally, I had no idea there was a problem with the way that we understand Song of Songs. But you're saying pretty much right out of the gate, we have these words, melech and alamot. And I hope my friend Daniel, who will be listening to this, isn't going to be mad at me if I had even slight pronunciation problems there. At your pace, dealer's choice here, I want you to break down what is the issue with those words as I or others who are not experts would be reading them in a biblical text.
Okay, sure. Just let me give you the first of all what the meaning is, the plain meaning of the words melech and alamot. The plain sense meaning of the word melech, the dictionary definition, is king. In other words, it's an ascription of royalty. It's a royal person. The verb form of the same word malach means to rule, as a king rules over others. And it's the word which you get at the beginning or ending of personal names. So you've got Melchizedek and so on and so forth. And the reason I wrote this article is to make the argument that when we see the word melech in the song, we should really take the plain meaning of the word as king, meaning a royal figure, rather than dismissing it and using some other kind of means to interpret it. There are at least two ways that people have unwittingly gotten rid of the royal person, the king here. The first is by a technique called soliloquy. You've probably heard of that. But a soliloquy is a monologue, essentially, where somebody addresses some speech or words to oneself. Not many take this line, but a more common way of taking melech today, and this is the part of the problem, really, is taking it as a figurative word rather than the literal king. And by doing this, the word ha-melech, the king, in the original, from a king, from a royal person, it becomes a commoner. And I think it does matter. The problem is it's destroying the literary integrity of the text. It destroys characterization, of course. What exactly is the text trying to convey by this king bringing this woman, whoever she is, into his rooms, his royal chambers? It destroys a narrative if there is any narrative there. Of course, there's a huge debate about this, whether there is a narrative or not. And most people today would dismiss the possibility of the songs having a narrative. But if there is one, it certainly destroys that. Of course, there's a theological message if one is taking that from the passage would get affected because if you're not having a king, and what does a king mean in this particular case, then you're going to get problems afterwards. So, for all of these reasons, really, and more, it really is necessary to know what you're looking at, what word that you're looking at, and the meaning of the word.
To circle back on the word soliloquy there,
Okay.
so the first thing that comes to mind is Hamlet. Is this the kind of thing you're talking about?
I'm not overly familiar with Hamlet, but if Hamlet is speaking to himself rather to anybody else, so there's no dialogue as such, it's a monologue and expressing his feelings, then that is essentially what I'm talking about. Yeah.
Okay, so like the to be or not to be, that is the
Yeah.
question. He's
So,
not speaking. Okay, you're not doing that though.
no, absolutely
Okay.
not. So I'm arguing that there's more than one person. In fact, I'm arguing there's more than two people here. And this is the crux of the matter, really. Traditionally, when interpreters looked at the passage, they saw a king, they saw a woman, and they saw a group of women as a third party as well. And the problem is that these days, what's happening is not only is the king, the royal person, being denuded of his kingship through the word, the meaning of the word, but also this group of women, which should be there, really, they have a voice and they're expressing something, they are also disappearing for various reasons. So my argument is that if we get this wrong, we're going to get the entire song wrong afterwards. There are three parties at the very least here in the beginning of the song.
And those are the king, his bride, and the women.
The king, the woman, and the women. I mean, we could discuss and debate whether a marriage is taking place, and I would personally say there is, but I'm not arguing that particular aspect in my paper, and at least on this particular occasion. But I would say if you look at the song in its entirety and you see it as a unity, again, another debate in that particular context, then if you're looking at the song as a unity, then I would say there is a wedding taking place.
Would the wedding be the narrative? Is that how we should understand this?
Again, this is a huge question whether there is a narrative or not. Coincidentally, my thesis for my PhD was the narrative of the Song of Songs. Now, the problem that has taken place over the last 150 years or so, perhaps a little more, is that there have been many narratives that have been suggested. And the problem has been that when people have taken narratives, they've tried to read things in and tried to formulate a narrative, try to cohere various parts of the song by introducing elements that aren't in the song. And what I do is actually I take the song as it is, but I look at the paratactical, in other words, the kind of coherence that the verses have. This is lyric poetry. It's not narrative. It's not narrative poetry. It's lyric poetry. So you could expect the language to be it's full of feeling, emotion, that sort of thing. But nonetheless, I argue that lyric poetry can convey a narrative, and it does in the Song of Songs.
Well, I don't know that I've ever heard the term living poetry. Can you
Oh,
go into
sorry,
that a little bit more?
pardon. Lyric poetry.
Oh, lyric.
Yeah,
Okay, I have heard of that. But
sure.
okay, is there an example of a solely lyric poem that you could point to that people might be familiar with?
I suppose any of the Psalms would be lyric poetry because they don't try to establish a narrative primarily. It's predominantly a person or people expressing their feelings and expressing facts, but through the medium of their feelings rather than telling a story.
Okay, and so this is lyric, and you're saying also communicating a narrative.
Absolutely. So I'm not dismissing the fact that the Song of Songs is lyric. The problem, however, and this stems all the way back from Aristotle, where Aristotle made a distinction between narrative poetry and lyric poetry, and never the two shall meet. And that kind of attitude still pervades today. And so what we have is, when it comes to the Song of Songs, people will dismiss the possibility of there being a narrative simply because it is lyric poetry, for other reasons also, which I'm sure we'll touch upon in due course. But I think the foundational argument is that because it is lyric and because it is primarily trying to get feelings across, this is not conveying a narrative at all. And I take issue with that, really.
I'm okay ignoring Aristotle. He created a lot of categories that I don't think are worth paying
Absolutely.
attention to. So you mentioned that for the last 150 years, how would you characterize that? Is there a singular way of understanding what that last 150 years has been? Has it been a critical approach to Song of Songs, or a theological approach, or some combination of the two, or
Uh,
something else?
the critical approach rose in around the 18th century, but alongside of that, another perspective arose. And that is what I'm referring to. It's the dramatic perspective. The dramatic perspective sees a rather bizarre story of sometimes they take it as three people, of there being a king, traditionally taken as Solomon, who's interested in a farm girl, and he steals her, would you believe it, from a shepherd boy who's her real lover, and she pines for the shepherd boy. Solomon is a thief, essentially, he's a kidnapper. He takes her to his harem, and she has this to and fro between her shepherd lover and the king. Others don't see three parties; they see two. So they see perhaps a shepherd and his beloved, the woman, or maybe a king and his beloved. But there are some differences of opinion there. But this perspective, this alternative perspective on what is known as drama, dramatic perspective, has been quite prevalent actually around, I would say, 1850s, early 1950s also as well. But it's lost its momentum now, and with the rise of looking at the poetic aspects of the Song of Songs, that has tended to fall away. But it's still around. It's still, you still find it in commentaries, or you would find it often spoken of in churches sometimes, which may take recourse to the older commentaries.
Has that been your experience in your pastoral work, that you've seen that happening in churches?
Interesting question. The Song of Songs is one of those books which is hardly spoken about in churches these days. Would you believe it? At one point of time, in the early church days, it was the most commented book of all of the books. But today, because of course it talks about love and sex, and people shy away from those things, and so you hardly hear the Song of Songs preached on or spoken of in church. You do find it, of course, but and it is read, but certainly not spoken of at length in any way, shape, or form.
Hold on. So it was one of the most commented on in
Yeah,
the early church. Uh,
yeah, around I would say third, fourth century thereabouts. It was one of the texts. Believe it or not, it was yeah heavily written on.
who is there? Are there any? Sorry, I don't know if this is something you're prepared to answer, and if not, we can. You could send me an email later if you want to. Who are there commentators that listeners should go look for that you think might be interesting?
Yeah, yeah. There's loads of them. So you could look at people, for example, Bernard, Saint Bernard. There's Gregory of Nyssa, the Cappadocian Fathers, and various others. So a lot of church fathers around that time have written on the song. And what they tend to do is, the reason it was so popular, they aren't actually looking at the song as a kind of love song predominantly. They recognized it was a love song, but they were looking at it through the filter of a relationship between God and his bride, the church. And for them, the woman in the song was this representative of the church, Christ's beloved, and she was being drawn into Christ's bosom, into his house. And they would argue that there were mystical truths that would be found in the Song of Songs if you were able to read it in that perspective.
That is interesting. Did they make the mistake of kind of muting out the women?
That is a good question. Now, not necessarily, but what tended to happen was, if you had, for example, allegory. Now, the allegory was predominantly interested, or should I say, the allegorical interpretation. The allegorical interpretation was predominantly interested in the spiritual aspect rather than the literal aspect. And so people wouldn't focus on the characters that were cropping up in the song so much. They would mention them, but then they would quickly pass on to the more spiritual dimension and what that meant for Christians. Or if the Jews did it, they would then comment on what it meant for Israel or the Jews today. And going back to allegory and church, I know of at least one person. It is Dorid of Cyrus. What he does is he says that the the words of the woman, the very first word of the woman, let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth. That's chapter 1, verse 2. So let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth. Now that should be the woman speaking to her beloved, or perhaps the group of women, as I argue, who are in the vicinity. Now, what Theodoret does is because he's committed to his allegorical approach, he sees the protagonist, the female protagonist, speaking to the groom's father, who is God, and the groom himself is Christ. And so she tries to express her looking forward to being with the groom, and she speaks to the groom's father. So Theodoret, what he is doing essentially is inadvertently getting rid of the woman's voice. But that sort of thing didn't happen so much in that day as it happens today for various reasons, where because of, for example, seeing these words as what is known as analogy. It's not the word analogy, it's another complex word, analogy, with an E. And that is a technique in which one grammatic form replaces another. So, for example, in Song chapter 1, verse 2, you've got let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth. So, this is, everyone would agree that this is the woman, and she is speaking to somebody. And then in the next part of that verse, it goes on, for your love is better than wine, as though she's switched the addressee, the person who she's speaking to, and she's speaking to somebody else now. Let him switch to for your love. And that technique it's a common technique found in poetry, and it's called analogy. And what that does is effectively gets rid of the women, because it could be the woman, the sole female protagonist, speaking on her own, and she is speaking in the first instance, let him, and she switches grammatical forms to for your love. But she's speaking to just one person, maybe the man here. But then what that does is it gets rid of the woman in the background, because I argue in my paper, when she begins speaking, let him kiss me, she's speaking to the woman in the background rather than speaking to her beloved. And then she turns around and she speaks to her beloved, to the man, and addresses him directly. For your love is better than wine. And the problem with analogy is it's gotten rid of those women in the background.
So there's a juxtaposition between, I guess, what we can call like a critical or a literary approach to this text and a spiritual, maybe theological. I'm not sure how you would want to characterize that. But is there, do you see what you're doing as trying to bring the two together? So there are people in their liturgical practices negotiating with the texts as a group, and then there is you as a scholar using the tools, the academic scholarly tools that you have. Are you trying to bring those two together?
I'll tell you what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to establish the literary layer to begin with. So I have no problem with people going on to take the literary layer and arguing for an allegory. Academically, that's a rather challenging prospect, actually, to try and prove that there is allegory. But if the church, Christians, or Jews want to take it as an allegory, that's their prerogative. But what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to show the literary characters, who's speaking to whom, and so on and so forth. I'm really looking at the predominant first layer, if you like, of the text. And what people have tended to do in the past is bypass that literary layer and effectively build a house with a second layer, but no first layer. So they're trying to build a house without the ground floor, essentially. And you can't do that. You've got to first of all establish what exactly the text is saying as it reads, and then if you want to argue for theology from that, you can do so. But I would say you really need to get that literary dimension correct first of all.
Do you find that to be a challenge, broadly speaking, as someone who is both a believer or observant, or however you want to characterize yourself as a Christian and a scholar. Is that a challenge?
I would say the greater challenge is trying to establish that the song is a theological piece, not necessarily allegory, because people can read theology from the song through other means. But I would say the greater challenge is to try and argue that the song is a theological text, that it has theological relevance. That is not to say that to argue that the literary dimension is important and how you go about doing that is without its own challenges. I mentioned one challenge earlier about trying to show that a lyric poem can express a story. In fact, for my PhD, when I was writing my thesis, the very first thing I did was to try and show that these two things can coexist within one text, lyric as well as narrative. And I do that by utilizing some German paradigms that have cropped up in the last 10 years or so. And they very ably show that rather than taking the Aristotelian model of narrative poetry and lyric poetry, and there's epic poetry as well, and trying separating all of those things from each other, that a text can have both lyric as well as narrative, but it could have it on a kind of scale, more lyric on one side or more narrative on the other, and so on and so forth.
Do you mind describing what those German tools or categories are?
Sure, it's essentially a model that they use to try and read lyric and look at narrative. It stems from what is known as a narratological perspective. In the last few decades, there's been a huge turn towards reading narrative. So it's part and parcel of that movement, narratology, essentially. And so what I do is I employ that perspective and I look at the Song of Songs, and I try and show that there is story there. What I try and shun away from and stay away from is those dramatic perspectives of the 19th century and early 20th century, where they were reading things into the song which weren't there.
So, a thing that I have been learning here is that there are more tools for literary analysis than I had realized. I had a literally elementary education. There's prose and there's poetry, and poetry does this, and prose does this. And as you get older, you do add some nuance. So, I'm aware that there are poems that tell stories, but and also why Germany? What does it matter that it came? I'm not arguing with you, but why did the Germans come up with this?
Oh, I don't know, but they just have, and I don't necessarily think it's the Germans exclusively. There are others in America as well, but I think the people who I've read have tended to be those Germans. So I think, yeah. So I can't remember the name now exactly, Peter somebody, but yeah, they've tended to be off that school.
Okay, I didn't know if there was something significant about Germany that, like, man, they're really good at running
No,
literature through a. Okay, they mechanize a lot of things, so I didn't know if this was another one. Okay, I know you've touched on the women as a character, and I think we would be remiss if we didn't maybe spend a significant portion of our time
Mhm.
talking about how. Okay, so is this like a Greek chorus? What is the substance of the women?
That is very interesting because certainly they keep on cropping up again and again. And I believe they have a significant part to play, that they aren't just casual bystanders. They certainly do make their presence felt at the very start of the song. So if we have a look at chapter 1, verse, let me just quickly have a look at my text here. So let's look at chapter 1, verse 4, for example. And this is where I take one particular verse and try and show that although the various forms of address seem to be flitting around a bit, and that is what has been labeled as analogy. Remember that technique I told you about where one grammatical form has been switched over to another? But what I try to do is I try to take it at face value and try to show that three parties are speaking and that you can actually take it that way. So if we could just have a quick look at this particular verse, chapter 1 and verse 4. So it begins there with, "Draw me after you, let us run." I believe that's the female protagonist speaking to her beloved, the man. Then it goes on, "The king has brought me into his chambers." And now that is the woman speaking to the ladies, because obviously she is referring to somebody other than the king. So who is that? And I posit there that it's a group of ladies. Now we'll come to the evidence for that as we move on. So in the next line, we have, yes, we will exult and rejoice in you. One interesting feature of the Hebrew language is that you can actually tell who is being spoken to here. You can't do that in English, unfortunately, because the word you tends to be utilized for both plural as well as singular, female, and male. But in Hebrew, you can actually distinguish the end forms for male, female, single, and plural. And in this particular case, you can find that when whoever's speaking here says, we will rejoice in you, you can see that it's a group of people speaking, but they are rejoicing in a single woman. So the word at the end is bach, which means in you. There's a group of people rejoicing. And so they are essentially this backdrop of people who are held up as celebrating this great event of this king bringing his beloved, his, I would argue, a bride, but not necessarily so in these first few verses. It's not so apparent in these first opening lines, but they are nonetheless, they are standing there, they are rejoicing in the fact that this king is bringing his woman into his house. And then it goes on to, the verse goes on to say, we will extol your love more than wine. So I've talked about we will exalt and rejoice in you, which is the ladies speaking to a woman. But now they switch tone and they say, we will extol your love. And your love in Hebrew is dodecha. And the cha there tells us that it's a man. So they've switched now from saying, we will rejoice in you, the fact that you are being brought into the king's house. They've now turned their attention to the man, and they are now rejoicing in the fact that he loves her so much that he's done so. And they are speaking to him. And then it closes, this particular verse closes with the words, rightly, they love you. They love you. Now, of course, the you at the end there is the cha again. So it means the man is being spoken to. But who are the they? And I've said that the group of ladies, you can't just dispense with them. They are part and parcel of the fabric of the texture. So you can't just remove them through soliloquy or analogy or whatsoever. You could see them as being very important, and they keep on cropping up again and again, in fact. So what I argue in my thesis as these opening verses do connect with later verses. For example, in chapter 6, you've got 60 queens being mentioned very clearly, 60 queens and 80 concubines, and they are rejoicing in the fact that this woman is being brought to the king's house. It doesn't quite say that, the king's house as such, in that particular part. But nonetheless, you have these women, 60 and 80, queens and concubines, who are rejoicing that there's this woman in their presence. So they keep on cropping up again and again. But you've also got this other group of women who are called the daughters of Jerusalem, which I think actually are the same people. But it's more tricky and difficult to argue that. I don't argue that in my particular paper that we're talking about here, speaking about the first few lines of the song, but you could make a case looking at the song right throughout where these daughters of Jerusalem are very important, and they do have a part to play actually in the song, in a crucial juncture of the song where the woman is looking for her beloved, and she misses him. She's searching for him in the streets and in the town, and she encounters them, and they ask her, who is your beloved and why is he better than other beloveds? And she has to answer the question why he is much better. And they also ask her, where does she live? Sorry, where does he live? Beg your pardon. Where does her beloved live? And she tells them, but I argue that this is a crucial juncture in the song where, on the one hand, she's been very coming to try and go away with her beloved. But there is this crucial juncture where she turns completely. She has this anagnoresis is the technical word, where somebody realizes something about another person. And she realizes something about her beloved that is different from other beloveds. And you have this huge poetic piece where she talks about her beloved being wonderful And the poetry goes from head to toe in a kind of what is known as a blazon, or a wasf in Arabic. But she is essentially speaking about her beloved in remarkable terms. But that turning point only came about because of that question posed to her by these women. So, coming back to your question, these women, which crop up throughout the song, they are very important. They're not just celebrating the fact that the king in the opening verses is bringing his bride to, I would say bride, I would argue the bride, but it's not so apparent in the first few lines of the song. But the king is bringing his beloved, let's say that, into his house. But they keep on cropping up again and again, provide that dimension of joy and of instigating and facilitating the woman's feelings as well.
So in there, there were a bunch of things, but one thing that stood out, so it reminds me of in this episode, as of our conversation is not out, so I don't know how much poking around you got to do, but it would not have been released. But my friend Daniel, I've mentioned him before, 10 years ago, he wrote a paper addressing, I think, Isaiah, like dialogues that we know in the Hebrew are dialogues, or
Mhm.
rather, experts know but in the Septuagint, the use of the word gar is like a transition that he's then relating to a debate in Romans. I'm not asking you to weigh in on that. I'm just bringing it up but these are things that it's an argument that's happening because when we read it in English, we have been, I think, conditioned to read it as a flow over here in the Greek New Testament, but in the Hebrew Bible, it would be. And this is one that I don't know that I would have picked up on the fact that multiple characters are speaking. Is
Okay.
that, how does that limit it? What do you think creates that limitation for an English translation? Because I was reading along with you as you were going through that, and I'm like, oh, I would not, I don't know that I would attract that.
Yeah, I think there is the issue, of course, of the grammatical forms. That creates a barrier. Another barrier I found is how you read. So, if you read linearly, I think you're going to end up thinking that there's a kind of hodgepodge of characters here. So, this is the traditional issue that the Song of Songs has faced. Who is actually in the Song of Songs? How many characters are there? Traditionally, it's been considered to be a wedding song for Solomon, or of Solomon, written by Solomon. There's a bride and a groom, and that perspective goes all the way back to origin and beyond. But if you really read the song, you'll find that the characters seem to change. So, on the one hand, the opening verses characterize the beloved, the man anyway, as a king. If you take the word melech on the face of things, he's a king. And the woman, she is not much characterized in those opening verses. But as we read on, certainly as we go on into verses 8 and so on and so forth, we find that she's adorned with clothing, and she's wearing perfume, and that seem to be very expensive. So she seems to be a refined, dignified woman. But when we look at intermediary verses, looking at verses 5, for example, or actually verse 7 and 8, chapter 1, verse 7 and 8, what we find is that the couple don't seem to be represented as royal in any case, or even rich for that matter. They just seem to be country folk. They're speaking to each other in terms of sheep. Where do you live? Where do your sheep lie? Where are you? And so on and so forth. So my job in my thesis, we're discussing things that lie beyond my paper, actually. But my thesis essentially deals with how do you reconcile all these characters? Do you have more than one couple? Why does it begin as a king with his beloved and then seem to shift to a man who's a shepherd with another woman who's looking after sheep and goats, and so on and so forth? And that is a huge question. I have tried to show that the pastoral language that you find in verses 7 and 8 need not mean that the couple are shepherd and shepherdess, because pastoral language, a person being a shepherd, tends to actually crop up in ancient texts as well for royalty. funny enough. And it goes all the way back to Mesopotamia. And you can see that thread right into later antiquity, where you've got a king who's considered to be a shepherd and he has sheep, and a queen or a princess is also considered to have goats or sheep as well. So this is metaphoric language that is used for the kind of pastoral concern that a king might have for his subjects. I lost the thread of the question now, but
No, that was good because that was really helpful because, well, so you're saying this pastoral language is figurative. And I think if you juxtapose the idea that some people are saying the language of a king is not literal, but which makes more sense that the royal language would mean a king and they would be using figurative language, which can be applied to a royal figure, or that there's a common figure and we're also using, so somehow here in poetry we're using literal language about their pastoral concerns. It seems like that kind of helps the thesis that you're saying, no, we're talking about a king, that's not figurative. Here, over here, the pastoral thing is figurative, which is a very common thing across a lot of different cultures, right?
yeah, what I would say is that the song is something of an enigma in as much as if you try and read it linearly, you're going to end up with problems. But what I've discovered is that in some parts, it's very royal. So in other words, there's a royal feel about it. The people are wearing things that are royal. There's an emphasis on their clothing, on the perfume. The word king comes up, the word princess comes up, and so on and so forth. And there are other aspects where this royalty is de-emphasized. So it's not emphasized, not stressed. So it seems to be as though the couple aren't royal. But I would say that it may just be apparent rather than the actual case. What I've tried to do is try to take these two aspects, these two sides. So there's this royal aspect and this non-royal aspect, and try to show that there's actually these two sides, these two dimensions of the text, but they do actually link up. Without going into the thesis proper, it's you've got to try and show a structure really to begin with, before you even argue about narrative. Got to try and show that the text has a structure. The problem is if you go back to the Enlightenment, when people from the Enlightenment read the text, what they tended to do was try and read linearly, and they floundered. They couldn't come to terms with it. And so you have somebody like Goethe, for example, the German literary figure. When was he now? I think 18th century. He tries to read the song and he calls it a charming confusion, simply because, try and paraphrase his words that he used. He says that the characters, the events are all driven one into another. And if you read the song in a straightforward manner, yeah, that's going to happen because you're going to encounter what seems to be different settings, what seems to be different people with different purposes. And this is an ongoing issue, actually. And what I try and do in my thesis, not my paper that we're discussing, funny enough, but my thesis is that actually these people are the same people. So there is a king in the beginning of the Song of Songs, but he is de-emphasized as it goes on, and then re-emphasized his kingship, and then de-emphasized, and so on and so forth. But there are these two strands, there are these two dimensions that all come together at the very end. And in fact, what I argue is that the song begins in a kind of in media res, in other words, in the middle of things. You have this technique that is often used today in movies. It was used in the ancient times as well. But if you see movies today, what they do is they start a scene perhaps in the middle of a plot, and then you wonder what's going on. And they try and fill in what's gone on before as the movie develops. So the same thing is, I argue in my thesis, happening in the Song of Songs. And you try and bring these two dimensions together. Funny enough, funny may be the wrong word, but good for me, of course, a narrative emerges. And what you begin with at the beginning is the king bringing his beloved into his house for a reason. But there's a reason that I go into in my thesis, which I can't do here, unfortunately.
That's fair.
We're not talking about that thesis here, really. We're talking about another paper. But you'd have to wait, I'm afraid, until I get my thesis out. I've just been a bit too slow, doing too many things, and so I think I need to really sit down and try and get that into print.
That's fair. Hey, I don't. You take all the time you need. I don't feel bad for bumping into your thesis though, because that means that I think you're pointing in the direction of your research more broadly in this article. I am wondering though, would it be helpful, since biblical texts are incorporated into people's worship, for the song to be performed? And is that something that you know of people doing or orchestrating?
That is a fantastic question, because whether the song is a performative piece, in other words, whether it is dramatic in terms of a stage. The word dramatic is a funny word. It could mean two things. It could mean that there's a dramatic element in terms of it could be shown to be a story, a narrative, essentially. And often people, when they use the word drama, that's what they tend to mean. But the word drama can equally apply to a performative piece, like a person appearing on stage. So it's a stage piece. Yes, I believe there is stage potential. And that is why you had these group of people in the 18th, 19th century who cropped up and tried to show that the song was a drama. So it has that performative potential. The problem, I would argue, is that the song is not intentionally written as a drama. It has the makings of a drama. You could, and certainly for my thesis, because obviously I'm arguing that there's a story, you could take that story, that narrative, and turn that into a drama. But I also argue that it was not intended to be a drama. So let's just try and illustrate that by taking a couple of literary pieces today. So let's take, for example, Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter. Both those were constructed originally as literary texts to be read rather than stage pieces, but they've been converted into movies. And I don't know whether the authors intended, perhaps J.K. Rowling may have, but I don't know about Tolkien. I doubt it very much that he would have created his works with the intention of being televised. He created his works to be read, but they were so good that they've been converted into films. In the same way, you have this Song of Songs, which I argue that it's not just lyric poetry. It is very paratactical. It is very lyrical in as much as it focuses more on feelings, and it's very terse in its kind of construction. And the language is quite terse for conventional narrative. But nonetheless, there's still, if you read it properly, I argue that a narrative emerges. And you could take that narrative and then dramatize it. Now, going back to the question whether it was dramatized, this is an argument. Back in the day, early days of the Jewish rabbis, there's one particular rabbi who tries to stop people from singing the Song of Songs in taverns, of all things. And so he says, he throws up his hands in frustration and he says, all these people who are singing the Song of Songs in taverns, and they shouldn't do so because it's holy and all the rest of it. And so he tries to show that the book is a holy book and it shouldn't be sung that way. But the people who argue that the song was originally constructed to be a stage piece say that they basically resort to this incident of this rabbi trying to stop people from performing it, as it were, in taverns and so on and so forth. I don't agree with that, really. I don't think that the song was originally created to be a stage piece at all. I think it was constructed. It's too complex. Let's put it that way. It's too complex, the way that it's constructed, put together, to be a stage piece. But going back to your question about the women, for example, and they keep on cropping up again and again, I said, but they do come up very significantly at crucial junctures of the song, almost like a Greek choir might crop up at crucial junctures and maybe evoke certain sentiments from the characters in the performance. So it is somewhat similar to it, but I wouldn't say it's a stage piece, no.
Maybe Tarantino could make something out of it. He's a pretty
You know
unconventional
what?
guy.
I'll tell you something. My narrative that I found makes the Song of Songs almost, I think, one of the earliest pieces to read like a Cinderella narrative. I believe there's a dark side of the song as well. This is a huge subject. It's certainly not a subject to be talked about at length today because it takes a little bit of discussion and argument, but I think that you could make the case where the song could be construed as one of the earliest Cinderella kind of narratives, where there's a woman who has been disadvantaged by some people and her beloved almost rescues her from that situation. I would argue that that's where we go. We go to the beginning of the song where the man is bringing his beloved into his house, into his palace, as it were.
That feels like the first cliffhanger on this pod because I don't make demands of my guest, but you will have to come back and flesh that out. But because
What?
we are, what's that?
Watch this space.
Yeah. But because we are going to have to wind this down, I like to make sure with the guests, is there anything in the article that you were really hoping I was going to ask about? And I know I tend to just follow whatever thoughts pop into my head as you're talking. Is there anything you wanted me to ask about that I left out in the article?
Oh, you could ask the question. I think your listeners, if anybody is familiar with commentaries on the song, then they might actually ask the question whether the song is a unity or is it a collection of songs. We could go back to around, I think, around the 16th century, where, sorry, let me clarify. I should answer the question, shouldn't I? You do want to ask the, you do want to ask the question before
I
I
asked
actually.
you here. You could say whatever you want.
Okay. So the question really is the Song of Songs, is it a unity? Is there a single song, or is it a collection of songs? So going back to the 16th century, there was a group of people who argued that it is a collection of eclogues. In other words, it's a collection of pastoral hymns or poems. That kind of progressed with the Enlightenment, and when it came to somebody like Herder, for example, Johann Gottfried Herder, he argued that the song was or is a collection of love songs. So, removing the religious element, it was purely a collection of love songs. When the Egyptian anthologies were published, so the love poetry from Egypt, people working on the songs got very excited and felt that this justified the fact that the song was a collection. I would say that it's not, primarily for the fact that I believe there is a structure, a proper, good, consistent structure that can be proven, and there's a narrative. But there are other reasons for that also. Also, I'm not the first or the only person to argue that the song is a unity. There have been many people. In fact, the song as a unity has been read right throughout history until around the 18th century, I would say, or 19th century for that matter. But there have been people before me in the last 30, 40 years or so who have argued for the unity of the song rather than it being a collection. And there are reasons for that. There's the form of the song, the way they relate to each other. The prologue, for example, and the epilogue have a very tight relation to each other. There are formal refrains that keep on cropping up again and again. So you've got, for example, there are certain refrains, he is mine and I am his, often spoken by the woman. And you can hear her voice throughout the song. It's not just in one place. It crops up more than once. You've got a formula which goes, do not stir love until it's ready. That's again spoken by the woman, and that it crops up 4 times in the song. And those people who try to argue that the song is a collection say this doesn't really prove that the song is a unity. You really have to try and show that the characterization and the settings, what seems to be a wide array of people and settings, you really try and prove that there's a consistency there or there's a progression. And that is what I've actually tried to show in my thesis. But I would say the song is a literary unity. There is a particular structure, there is a progression that can be proven. And that is why when I talk about the Song of Songs, I talk about it as a song rather than a canticle of canticles. So let me try and give you a bit of background here. So when it comes to abbreviations for different books of the Bible, Song of Songs has 2 abbreviations. So you could either say song, for example, song chapter 1 and so on and so forth, or you could use the word cant, C-A-N-T, which is the abbreviated form of canticles. I don't like the word canticles simply because that leads to the impression that it's a collection, whereas I would argue it's a literary unity. So there's one song and there's a definitive structure, which again, you've got to watch the space for, and it would be part and parcel of when I come to it, talking about my story and why it's different from other stories that people have spoken about. So I would say that there's a single song and there's a literary unity to it.
Where would you direct people to learn more about Song of Songs? And it can be any medium that you think is helpful.
I suppose it does depend on the audience. Are we talking about people who are scholars or people who are novices, people who haven't confronted the Song of Songs before?
The scholars can figure their stuff out for themselves. They're not my problem.
Okay. So we're talking about lay people, perhaps. There are commentaries available. Some good commentaries that. Do you want to know some names?
If you have them, if you don't want to rattle them off the top of your head, we can just get an email and I'll put them in the show notes.
Yeah, I think I'd rather do that because I could spell out a few here, but they really are diverse and they range from religious commentaries to more secular commentaries. So people looking at literary dimension, people talking about a theological dimension, and so on. So
Okay.
there's a huge array of them, really.
We'll do that. Okay, what do you read for fun?
What do I read for fun? Oh, wow. I read all kinds of things. I love Star Trek. I enjoy Star Trek. I enjoy sci fi. I like watching sci fi films. I watch that a lot. What do I read for fun? On the other hand, I like reading how to do it books, DIY stuff. So if I'm trying to learn something new, I like looking at how to do it books.
What's an example of that?
Uh, how to play the ukulele.
Really? Are you
Yeah,
learning that?
I'm actually learning the ukulele. So I've never been a musician. I've always stood in awe of people who know how to play an instrument, and my wife is a good player. She plays the piano, but I've always stood in awe of other people. And I said to myself, I think it's high time maybe I learn something. What instrument is out there that I could take up which might be simple to get on with, simple to play, and learn quickly? I said, okay, ukulele. It's small, it's portable, and there's only 4 strings. The guitar, I think, has 6, doesn't it? 4 is better than 6, so I took up the ukulele.
Cool. Any sci-fi in particular, other than Star Trek, that you would recommend to people? What deserves more attention?
Oh, if you're asking me the question whether Star Wars or Star Trek, I would always say Star Trek.
Oh, no, that's fine. No, I'm saying, is there something in the sci-fi space that you feel like people should know more about this?
Oh, I'll tell you what. I'll tell you that I've actually got some theological lessons from Star Trek. Do you watch Star Trek by any chance?
I have. I don't on an ongoing basis. Deep Space Nine is my favorite. I'll say that.
Oh, okay. Okay, sure. Then you'd be familiar with what is known as the Prime Directive.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. In some of my theological works, certainly not the Song of Songs, but the question is always posed, why doesn't God try and teach people modern stuff? When if he's so powerful, if he's so knowledgeable, why doesn't he do that? I try to argue that there is a kind of prime directive going where if you try and advance civilization too soon, then they wouldn't be able to handle it. And that appears in Star Trek a lot. That's just one argument. It's not the only argument, but certainly what you find throughout the scriptures is that although I suppose God could have dealt with something like slavery, for example, way back in times of the Exodus, then surely he'd have done it back then. Why would he allow slavery to even be permitted? This is a huge question, actually. We're getting off topic. But what I would say is that he doesn't really try and remove it completely because it's the culture of those days. And it was something that was part and parcel of the ancient Near East at that time, and it could cause more damage than good if you try and just remove it. The life was very different at that time. When a person went into debt, sometimes he actually sold himself into slavery. So slavery sometimes existed because a person went into debt because of his own problems, and he willingly went into slavery. And so you don't find that slavery was just abolished in those days. And I liken that to a prime directive, where if you try and remove or change cultures too quickly, too soon, you might end up creating more harm than good.
I think I'm finding that at least between you and James McGrath, I may be able to put together a panel and have a
Mm.
sci-fi biblical scholar sci-fi panel at some point. I don't want to keep you all day, so unless you have anything else, I feel like we can call this one good.
Oh, I don't think there's much else we can say, but hopefully you've got a feel of the Song of Songs. There's a huge array of books. A lot of the poetry that we know about today and our improvement in understanding the poetry comes from the ancient Near East, for example. So there are parallel texts from the ancient Near East. We've got the Egyptian text, we've got Mesopotamian texts, we've got texts from slightly later, Arabia, also Greek texts as well, which highlight and throw light on the poetic dimension of the song. So there's a lot there that could be said and spoken about, really. But I guess we don't have too much time now. So
We'll get to that next time. Gavin Fernandes, thank you for being here.
thank you. Thanks very much for having me.
Thank you for listening. Next week on the podcast is Edmund Gallagher, who will be discussing his Journal of Biblical Literature article, Suddenly and Then Gradually, The Growth of the Septuagint and Its Canon. Here's a quick preview of that. Enjoy and take care.
There were a lot of reasons for the division of the East from the West, but perhaps one could say that the translation was a part of that. It did come up later. I mean, 1,000 years after Jerome and Augustine, you do have people talking, people in the West talking about how our Bible is better than their Bible over there. The Septuagint is not as good as the Vulgate. So for a famous example of that is there's this Bible just before the Reformation happens. In the 16th century, it's created in Spain. It's called the Complutensian Polyglot. And it's a Roman Catholic production. A Roman Catholic cardinal, this guy named Cardinal Jimenez, was the driving force behind the Complutensian Polyglot. And it's called a polyglot because it has multiple languages in the Bible. It's got Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. And the Latin Vulgate is in the middle, and the Hebrew and the Greek are on the side, but on either side of the Latin Vulgate. And Cardinal Jimenez, in his preface, said, "We put the Vulgate in the middle between the Hebrew and Greek, just like Jesus between the two thieves." So it's this idea that the Hebrew is corrupt, that Jewish text is corrupt, and the Septuagint from those evil Greek Orthodox people is corrupt, and it's our Latin Vulgate, the Bible that we happen to use, that alone preserves the purity of the Word of God.